Hello everyone and welcome to this week's episode of the Aftermath series. Let us waste no time at all and dive right into this week's episode of Critical Role. And while this episode was, in general, an easygoing shopping episode, there were still a few intriguing things that I'd like to touch on. In this episode, we saw a few hints of character progression with a few members of the Mighty Nine. The first minor one being with Bo. At the very beginning of the episode when the party was deciding on who was going to go where, Bo had made mention that she wanted to go to this library because she was interested in books. Now previously, Bo has made it apparent that she does not really care for schooling or learning through reading different tomes and books. So this was just a very minor detail that I thought was rather interesting that Bo had said. And on the topic of books, the other sort of minor character progression was with Caleb. Now, it's obvious that Caleb gets very excited when books enter the picture, and that was very clear in this episode. He just had this air of confidence and happiness about him because he got to go to this library. Absolutely adorable to see, but what I want to talk about is the fact that he decided to clean shave his beard and remove his wraps around his arms that sort of reveal the techniques that were used on him during his time with the Empire. This to me sort of symbolizes a new beginning, a clean start for Caleb. And we'll have to see if moving forward, Caleb is a bit more open with how he feels about different aspects of his life, or if he will keep this newfound confidence with him. Regardless of what happens, it was an absolute delight to see Caleb in a bit more of a lighter mood, given how he's been the past few episodes. And then, of course, the big character interaction this episode being with Fjord and the half-orc. Fjord is obviously pretty self-conscious with his appearance. He even went as far as trying to file down his tusks to sort of separate himself from his orcish blood. We see that he becomes a bit more uncomfortable when he's met with a pureblood orc, seeing how Fjord's physique is rather diminished when compared to others of his kind. And this interaction with the blacksmith seemed to be the straw that broke the camel's back, sort of. He was already a little off-put by this gentleman, but I think what really did it in was Jester coming into the establishment, and she was just in awe of this blacksmith. And I did see a hint of jealousy in Fjord's eyes. Now, I could be reading into that a little too much, but because of Jester's comments about this half-orc, Fjord quickly left the establishment and didn't really want any part of it anymore, because he likely felt self-conscious and sort of offended of himself, perhaps, because he knows he's not up to the standards of typical half-orcs. But a very touching and heartfelt conversation happened soon after that, as the blacksmith seemed to sense this conflict and sort of turmoil within Fjord. Perhaps this particular half-orc had the same issues. Maybe he went through the same experiences as Fjord, and the same sort of internal conflict of coming to terms with who you are. It was a very nice moment for Fjord, and I think one that he desperately needed, since it does seem like he is struggling greatly with accepting who he is. But it's understandable too, because in this episode also we got a sort of rehashing of Fjord's backstory, how he never knew his parents, he grew up in an orphanage, he was picked on by the other kids for being half-orc, so it makes sense that Fjord really struggles with coming to terms with his other half. I, for one, am definitely interested in learning more about Fjord's upbringing. We did touch on Fjord's backstory a little bit with the whole pirate arc that they had in the Menagerie Coast, but I believe there is still far more to be learned from our dear half-orc. But for now, I hope that with this conversation and newfound friendship with this blacksmith, Fjord can start to have a more positive outlook on who he is. But what's also funny about that moment is that Jester is typically good at making others feel better when they're down on themselves. But in this moment, Jester sort of picked up that Fjord was possibly jealous, or obviously felt bad about this whole circumstance that he was in. And Jester tried her best to uplift his spirits, but sort of failed, and only seemed to make matters worse. Which isn't necessarily a first for Jester, because she's had similar slip-ups like that in the past, but given her conflicting emotions with Fjord, it kind of makes sense that she would struggle with trying to find the right words to say to uplift him, since she might feel a bit awkward about it. She knows that she just was in awe of this new half-orc, so she might feel weird about then trying to compliment Fjord. There's just a whole bunch of different aspects to this that I thought it was still a relatively cute moment, even though Fjord seemed a bit annoyed about the whole situation. But now, moving on with the episode, we were introduced to an extremely interesting NPC, Professor Wacko. Now, the big thing that interested me about Professor Wacko is that she is an orc. Orcs are typically seen as less intelligent than the average being, so it's just very nice to see an orc represented in such a manner. And while she might be a bit on the crazy side, she still gave off an impression that she was very intelligent and not someone to be messed with. But I am intrigued to learn more about these war machines that she's been designing, specifically the war bodies, I believe was mentioned. Now this makes me think of something along the lines of a mech suit, or perhaps she is creating Warforged? Perhaps this is Matt's way of placing Warforged beings into the world of Exandria. But one of my favorite things about this whole setting of Exandria is the fact that there are these inventors and designers that are sort of making incredible breakthroughs that we get to witness. So it's an interesting thing where we get to witness history within this world. And I'm also really loving this dynamic between Professor Wacko and this foreman fellow. It seems that they have a little bit of a rivalry going, and that became very apparent with the obvious distaste that Professor Wacko was showing towards the foreman, and her special request about embarrassing him. And then obviously once they got to the camp, the foreman was trying to persuade the party to sort of go against Professor Wacko and to give all the credit to his den. And all of that led to an amazing RP performance by Travis Willingham. Oh my goodness, do I absolutely love it when Fjord goes all badass. Pretty much that whole sequence of events, I was just like, oh shit. Ugh, I just absolutely love moments like that where Fjord can really showcase his intimidating side. It's really just such a treat to watch because Travis is so good at role-playing those moments. And moments like that sort of reinforce the provoke task that Uk'otoa has given Fjord. Because honestly, I would say that he was definitely provoking him. I'm sure we're going to be seeing intimidating Fjord again in the near future and for many, many occasions to come, and I honestly cannot wait to see them. But now going back to a little bit earlier in the episode with the party accepting the quests that Professor Wacko gave them, they had to move through these ghost lands. And while there is nothing significant that happened in this episode regarding them, we did learn a little bit of its history, it being the last battlefield of the Betrayer Gods when they still walked the earth. It just felt like a really cool and sort of eerie historical moment as the party traversed this forsaken landscape. Just the thought of thousands and thousands of years ago, this climactic battle taking place, and they are walking its path, walking through and seeing all of the destruction it had, and seeing all of the wandering souls that are now trapped here. Just overall a very simple but awesome moment nonetheless. But now moving on to the end of the episode, the party now has to deal with a group of giants that I'm assuming are stone giants. And let me tell you, I'm sure you've all looked at the stat block of stone giants. They're pretty much a force to be reckoned with. The party is going to have a pretty rough fight on their hands. Of course, being level 9 and having access to 5th level spells, they probably have some pretty decent options on how they can deal with this threat. So while I'm not too terribly worried, there is still a little bit of an air of, oh boy, this might go badly. But you know, I try to stay on the positive side, so I'm gonna say I have full confidence that the party will be able to tackle this task easily. I hope I do not regret saying that. Overall, this was just a very nice shopping episode. Not too much happened, relatively lighthearted. A nice few tidbits of character progression and backstory rehashing, a few awesome moments between new characters, and a welcoming, new, interesting NPC, and of course, finishing it off on a little bit of a cliffhanger as the party attempts to complete the task that Professor Wacko has placed on the Mighty Nine. And with all of that being said, we are going to wrap up. Let me know what you guys think about the episode. Let me know all of your thoughts, feelings, emotions you had during it all. You can vent all of that down in the comment section below. I hope you all have an absolutely wonderful rest of your weekend, and I will see you all next week.